Hey everyone, welcome. In this explainer, we're going to break down the fundamentals of environmental pollution. We'll be taking a look at what happens in our air, our water, and our soil, all based on the source material. All right, let's take a quick look at our game plan. We're going to start with the basic concepts. Then we'll walk through the three main areas: air, water, and soil. After that, we'll see how pollution is measured, and we'll wrap up with the most important things to remember. Okay, let's dive right in. First things first, we gotta define what pollution actually means. And right away, there's a really important distinction we need to make that's gonna come up again and again. Okay, so here's the first big idea. Not all pollution is the same. You've got your primary pollutants. Think of the exhaust coming straight out of a car's tailpipe. That stuff is harmful from the second it's released. But then you have secondary pollutants. These are created when those primary pollutants spill up into the atmosphere and react with sunlight and other chemicals, kind of like a chemical soup. Smog is a classic example. It's a key difference, so keep it in mind. All right, with that foundation, let's jump into our first big area and see how this all plays out in the air that we're all breathing. Let's kick things off with a really important one: carbon monoxide. The best way to picture what it does is to think of a key that fits into a lock, but it's the wrong key, so it gets stuck. In your blood, hemoglobin is the lock that carries oxygen, while carbon monoxide is that wrong key. It slides right in and jams the lock, which means oxygen can't get delivered to your cells. That's why it's so incredibly dangerous. And of course, it's not just carbon monoxide. There's a whole crew of other air pollutants. You've got carbon dioxide, which acts like a heat-trapping blanket around the Earth. You've got oxides of nitrogen that can directly damage our lungs. And then there's particulate matter. And this is interesting. It's not a gas. It's actual tiny solid particles of dust and soot that can get lodged deep in your respiratory system and cause some serious problems. And check this out, this is a perfect example of that whole primary versus secondary pollutant idea we just talked about. It all starts with primary pollutants, like sulfur oxides from a power plant. They float up into the atmosphere, mix with water, and boom, they transform into a secondary pollutant, acid rain. And the effects of that can be huge, damaging everything from forests to buildings. Okay, so we've covered the air. Now let's shift gears and see what happens when pollutants get into our most vital resource, our water. Now, this is a really fascinating chain reaction, so follow me here. When something like sewage enters a river, it's not the waste itself that kills the fish. Instead, that waste becomes an all-you-can-eat buffet for bacteria, so the bacteria population just explodes. And as all these new bacteria live and breathe, they use up all the dissolved oxygen in the water. This literally suffocates everything else, creating what are called dead zones. And you know, a very similar process is called eutrophication. But this time, it's not started by sewage, but by nutrients, things you find in fertilizers or detergents. These cause a massive, explosive growth of algae, an algae bloom. But here's the catch. When all that algae eventually dies and sinks, the same thing happens. Bacteria move in to decompose it, they suck up all the oxygen, and the whole aquatic ecosystem just crashes. When it comes to chemical threats in water, man, they are all over the map. But we can kind of group them into a few main buckets. You've got your inorganic pollutants, like toxic heavy metals, think lead and mercury. Then there are organic chemicals, like oil and pesticides that can cause serious long-term health problems. And finally, you have those plant nutrients we just talked about, the ones that kickstart that whole eutrophication process. All right, from the water, let's move on to the ground beneath our feet. We're going to look at the soil, where some of the most stubborn pollutants can build up for years, even decades. Okay, everyone, listen up, because this is probably one of the most critical concepts in the whole chapter: bioaccumulation. Here's how it works. A tiny bit of a pesticide is in the soil and gets into a plant. An insect eats that plant. Then a small fish eats hundreds of those insects. A bigger bird comes along and eats dozens of those fish. You see what's happening? At each step up the food chain, that toxin becomes more and more concentrated. By the time it reaches that top predator, a tiny initial dose has become a deadly poison. But here's a really interesting wrinkle. Not all pesticides are created equal. On one side, you have something like DDT. It's what's called a chlorinated hydrocarbon. The key thing is, it doesn't break down easily. It persists, it sticks around in the environment for years, which is what allows it to bioaccumulate. On the other side, you have things like organophosphates. They're actually more toxic right away, but they break down quickly, so they don't have time to build up in the food chain. All right, so we've talked about what the pollutants are and where they end up, But how in the world do scientists actually track them down and measure how much of this stuff is out there?
And this brings us to another super important distinction: point source versus non-point source. A point source is exactly what it sounds like. You can point to it. It's a single smokestack on a factory or one pipe dumping waste into a river. Easy to identify, easy to monitor. But a non-point source, that's a whole different beast. It's diffuse. Think about the runoff from a massive farm field or all the tiny oil drips from every car in a city. It's coming from everywhere at once, which makes it so much harder to control.
So to really get a handle on how we measure these things, especially when they're in tiny, tiny amounts, let's start with this number, 1 million.
This leads us to the standard unit of measurement here, parts per million, or ppm. Just imagine one single drop of gasoline in a bucket with 999,999 drops of water. That single drop is 1 part per million. It sounds like an unbelievably small amount, right? But for many toxic chemicals, a concentration of just a few parts per million is more than enough to cause serious, serious harm.
Okay, let's pull everything together now. We'll wrap up with a quick summary of the absolute must-know points from our discussion.
So if you're studying for a test, this is your checklist. These are the 5 things you absolutely have to walk away with. First, know the difference between primary and secondary pollutants. Second, remember the 3 domains: air, water, soil. Third, be able to explain point versus non-point sources. Fourth, and this is a big one, remember those 3 key processes: acid rain, eutrophication, and bioaccumulation. And finally, know that we measure this stuff in parts per million. If you get those down, you've got a really solid handle on this topic. You know, the source material leaves us with this really powerful idea. Back in the day, miners would actually bring a canary into the coal mine with them. If the air became toxic, the little bird would get sick first, and that was the signal for the miners to get out immediately. In the same way, when we see damage and disease in the natural world because of pollution, it's often an early warning sign for our own health.
And that really leaves us with something to think about, right? If the health of the environment is our canary in the coal mine, what signs might be visible in your own community, right where you live? What could the plants and animals around us be telling us about the health of our planet, and ultimately about ourselves?